Mark, thanks so much for making it. We're super excited to have you here.
Good morning.
You've been around, you've seen this movie before, and there's a lot of excitement around AI these days. Is there an AI bubble?
So AI is a really interesting concept, kind of from beginning to end. So AI is a very old idea. The idea of AI actually traces all the way back to the invention of the computer. And there's one of my favorite stories in the history of our industry is Alan Turing, the great inventor, and a co-inventor of the computer it's like 1944. Alan Turing was at Bell Labs in New Jersey, and he was having lunch with Claude Shannon, who was the inventor of information science. And they got in a big argument about AI, and because Turing was proposing that we could make AI, just a pretty advanced thought for computers at that time. And Claude Shannon was skeptical, and he's like, I don't know if we can get computers to think the way that people do. And Turing got more and more frustrated and finally stood up and yelled in the middle of the cafeteria, I'm not talking about making a genius computer brain. I'm talking about making a mediocre brain like the president of AT&T. Which is a big hit in the executive dining room. And so that sort of, and by the way, that actually began the debate about like what is the definition of AI, right? Is it replicating human intelligence, or is it actually creating a sort of a new form of intelligence? And so that's like 1944, this is like what, 70, 80 years ago. Over that period, of course, many people have spent their careers trying to build AI. I think we've counted there were 5 boom-bust cycles in AI leading up to where we are today. So there would be tons of AI hype and enthusiasm, and then there would be kind of these AI winters. When I actually arrived in the Valley in the early 90s, there had been an AI boom-bust in the 80s, right? That didn't pan out. Expert systems was a big thing at the time, and it didn't really work. Our assessment is this time is different, and the reason this time is different is because the technology has finally started to work in a real and deep and serious way. And we think the breakthrough was around 2012, and specifically, right, it was the ImageNet competition in 2012 that kind of demonstrated computers starting to advance beyond human beings in terms of image recognition. And then, of course, generalizing from that, if computers can recognize images, then they can do lots of other interesting things, right? Get increasingly smart. And so we think prime time has arrived.
Got it. So it's actually, the technology actually works now. That's the difference. Makes sense. That's a lot of, we're not disagreeing with that. So you see a lot of startups, hear a lot of pitches. Of the hundreds of ones that you see every year, what stands out in the ones that really succeed, and what stands out in the ones that sort of fail? And what would you see most common mistakes are that startup founders do?
Yeah, so it actually turns, so it's thousands a year.
Okay,
It's the rough numbers. So for sort of U.S. venture, U.S. high tech. So this is not counting Europe or Asia, just U.S. It's about 4,000 startups a year that are, I'd say, venture fundable. Mm-hmm. We see about 2,000 of those. We narrow that down to about 30 bets a year. So we invest at a rate of about 1.5%. Which means we're in the world's most weird optimistic, pessimistic job, right? Because you never know when one of the 30 is going to walk in the door, but 98.5% of the time, it's not. And so your day job is crushing entrepreneurs' hopes and dreams, with the occasional exception, right? And so it's a harsh job. The reason it's such a harsh job is because it is so hard to build a successful startup. Elon Musk has the best line on the nature of high-tech startups. He said, doing a high-tech startup is like chewing glass. Eventually you start to like the taste of your own blood. And I always love the reaction that comment gets from people, because that's like, yeah, that's the feeling. Like, that's what it's like. It's just like, oh my God. And so it is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. The winning companies, there's some kind of magic or alchemy, the way things come together, but it always kind of resolves down to 3 fundamental elements. You have to have a significant advance in technology, at least 2x and maybe on the order of 10x to really have a margin of safety to be able to do it. And so there has to be some sort of step function change in the technology. And the reason for that is, right, big companies are very good at incremental change. And so for a startup to exist, kind of by definition, it has to be a big enough leap in technology that's going to kind of take all the big incumbents by surprise. So a significant advance in technology, and those just don't come along, often enough. And then you need a big market, right? Because if you have a big advance in technology for a small market, you'll get a small result. And so you need a big market to be able to build a big company behind that. And then, of course, you need the team. And you need, not just the founder or the founding team. You also need the ability of the founder and the founding team to bring together a team around them, right? Peter Thiel says one of the most interesting things he said is it's everybody focuses on like, how's the startup going to hire like its second engineer? And the more relevant question is how's this going to hire its 20th engineer, right? And then its 200th engineer, and then at some point its 2000th engineer, right? Because you have to build a critical mass of a team to be able to execute against a big idea. And so is the team able to kind of convey the kind of vision required to be able to pull people in and then be able to build the kind of team spirit required to execute against a big goal? And so it's like 3 really big challenges, and it's as you know, like it's really hard to line those up.
That makes sense. Okay, I'm going to see if I can get this out of you. Are there any investments in the last 10 years that you look back and you say, I wish I had invested in that company?
That we wish we had invested?
That you had, yeah.
Yeah, there are.
Okay. Do you mind sharing or telling us more about this?
So I described the sort of 2000 to 30 thing. There are basically, right, 2 forms of mistakes then in our business, right? There's the false positive and the false negative. The false negatives are kind of the false positives are the mistakes you make all the time, right? It's the investment, it's the company you invest in that doesn't succeed. And those are frustrating, but sort of the statistical nature of venture capital is that, like Silicon Valley venture capital basically is, basically half the companies aren't going to succeed. That's kind of the long run statistical distribution. And so you know that you're going to basically have false positives about half the time if you're doing your job right. Right, and the reason for that is if you're not taking enough risk where you're going to get some false positives, you're also not taking enough risk to invest in the ones that are going to work, right? And so it's sort of part of the thing. The saving grace on the ones that don't work, right, that you invest in, they don't work, the saving grace is you can only lose 1x, right? And that's horrible. Like, it does still go to 0, so that does still really suck. But, it's capped losses. Then there's the false negatives, which is, the company walks in the door, you don't invest, and then for the next 20 years you're reading headlines in the Wall Street Journal about how well the company's doing. Like, every morning you wake up and you're just being like mentally tortured by how well this company is doing. And it's funny because right, what you've done is this opportunity cost. You've missed out on basically the unbounded upside, right? And so the sort of theoretical opportunity loss is essentially infinite. And every day, as the company goes public, and every day the stock price goes up, and it just gets harder and harder and harder. It's a screwdriver in the stomach, and so that does get more and more painful. And at this point, I hope I've run out the clock, so I don't have to name names.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get a name out of you. Okay, makes sense. Okay, let's move on to the promise of AI. So, you have a really unique vantage point. I mean, you've seen the movie. You started Netscape. You've been around. What do you think? What is the impact that AI will have on various industries, and what are maybe some of the killer apps that will emerge in this field?
Yeah, so there's a big debate I think happening in our industry right now, and this conference is right at the heart of it, which is okay. Is AI an incremental advance, right? Is AI a feature that we're going to add to all the existing products and technologies, right? And so, at one point speakers were dumb and now they're smart. At one point, whatever app you have, it didn't have any AI, now it has a little AI. And right, by the way, it's like every pitch we say, it's sort of funny when these new technologies arrive because you see it, you experience it in the venture pitches, which it's like, the entrepreneur will come in and they'll talk about, they'll have 6 attributes of the thing that they're building. It'll be, it'll be big data, boom, 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 it'll be other stuff, scalable, secure, and then bullet point number 6 will be like AI. And it's like, can I see the version of these slides from 2 weeks ago that had 5 bullet points, where that 6th one just kind of got added right before the pitch, right? And so that's, and by the way, most advances in technology are incremental, right? Most of them are just features that you add in. And so maybe AI is one of those things. Maybe AI just kind of gets sprinkled on everything, and everything gets a little bit better. Or maybe it's a profound change, right? Maybe it's what we would refer to as an architectural change, right? It's sort of a new foundational technology where as we get it to really work, we can all of a sudden rethink things kind of from the ground up, right? How systems should work from the ground up. And so, instead of computers having screens, maybe it's entirely voice, right? Maybe business applications, instead of being, spreadsheets and rows and columns, maybe it just gives us the answer, right? And so if it's that big of an advance, then it's an architecture change. And then in our industry, if it's an architecture change, that leads to ultimately an almost complete turnover, right, of products, because basically products then have to get reinvented from scratch. And then over time, it leads to an almost complete turnover of companies, right? Most companies that get built on one architecture don't survive an architecture change. And so those are the really big transitions, right? And so what have those transitions been, right? There's been a few: mainframe to mini computer to Unix, Unix to PC, PC to smartphone. Like those have been big ones. Client server to web. Actually, client-server to web was probably a bigger change. Web to mobile was actually not as big a change, and the way you know that is because most of the big web companies actually became mobile companies, right? You didn't tend to have Google as an example. You didn't have a new mobile search company displacing Google as the web search company just because mobile arrived. So even mobile was not even like a complete architecture change in a lot of areas. Our sense is that AI definitely has the potential to be one of these changes, and that's sort of our approach. We're assuming that it does, and we're actively looking and funding companies that are thinking about a complete reinvention of how things work. I mean, some of the best examples are now incredibly obvious, but just as an example, we have this drone company called Skydio that's complete autonomous drone. So it's like the drones that you buy, DJI drones or whatever you buy. It's like a flying camera, but it doesn't even ship with a controller. Like it doesn't even have a controller because it's entirely it flies itself. You just tag it to yourself or a person, and then it basically is a flying camera. It operates in follow me mode, and it's just incredibly high quality in terms of its level of autonomy. And so that's the kind of thing where all of it, like assuming we're right about that, and you can see the products. If you look up Skydio on YouTube, you can see this in action. And so if that's the case, then the previous generation of drones, like literally, are all obsolete today. Right, because there's now a fundamentally different way of doing things, and so our sense is there's a real possibility that this will happen across lots of areas.
I see. I get the thinking. So basically, it's the 10x difference.
Yeah.
So that's what you should
10x
think
or
about.
even bigger. It's almost like binary. It's like there's a set of things we just simply could not do, and now there's a set of things that all of a sudden we can do. It's like the inventors and the architects of the previous generation of products hadn't even envisioned that this would ever be possible.
So a phase shift, basically.
Yeah.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So think about that when you're pitching. Okay. All right.
And by the way, an AI should be the first bullet point on the slide.
Exactly. So one of the major things we've actually heard today is about the skills gap. And also yesterday, a lot of companies are struggling to find data scientists that are skilled, people that know DevOps, data engineering, data science. And a lot of them say, it's really about the data. The data part is the hard part. I'm curious, when you talk to enterprises, I mean, you must talk to a lot of these big enterprises. What are the data challenges that they mentioned to you that they have? What are their struggles?
Yeah, so I think the big one is skills and cultural. And we can come back to the data, but let's talk about skills and cultural stuff because I think it's the thing that dominates. And so I think there's a really good thing that's happening and there's a really kind of scary thing that's happening. So the good thing that's happening is as follows. So if you had asked me 3 years ago, actually because we got excited about AI, back 2012, 2013, 2014. When this all started to change. For the first couple of years, we were fairly disconcerted by the whole thing, and the reason is because the view at that point was AI is like a black art, like it's this like hyper-specialized thing, right? In fact, it was a field that had gotten quite discredited for a long time, and so there were actually not that many AI PhDs coming out of the top research programs, basically for the preceding 15 years. It's just a limited number of people who were trained in the area. And then the big incumbents, the Googles and Amazons kind of figured this out early, and then they figured out how valuable it was, and so they started hiring all the PhDs for gigantic amounts of money. Right, and Google has like an internal spreadsheet basically showing like if you have an AI PhD applied to this part of how ad targeting works, we can incrementally generate another $100 million of profit a year just through algorithm changes. And so we'll pay this AI expert whatever $10 million a year. It's easy, and hope he doesn't discover the spreadsheet because then we'd have to pay him even more. And so basically in the first 2 or 3 years, the incumbents basically hired many of the experts. And of course, for us, in venture, that's really bad because it's like, okay, well then who's going to start the companies or who's going to go to work for the startups and make this stuff work? And so we were discouraged out of the gate. We were wondering whether there would be AI startups that were viable just because of the talent restriction. And of course, the same question then had to be asked of how existing companies in other industries, right? How are car companies possibly going to adapt? How are aerospace companies going to adapt? Or medical technology companies going to adapt if they can't hire the people? I think it's been dramatic in the last 3 years how much the field has really opened up and expanded. And obviously this conference is a great example of that. And it's sort of this, all of a sudden, it's like the rush of enthusiasm, right, coupled to the real world results has led to, number one, just a massive increase in the number of people interested in the field, a massive increase in the number of students at university learning about this stuff, and then also a massive kind of re-education happening inside the industry, right? And a lot of, many programmers today are retraining themselves on AI. In fact, one of the companies we backed, Udacity, is actually created by an AI pioneer out of Stanford, and actually it has online courses to basically help programmers retrain onto AI. And so we see kind of a dramatic retraining taking place, and then also this rise of open source, right? TensorFlow and all these other technologies, and then the rise of the cloud AI offerings from the big cloud providers have really opened up the field. And so the number of people who are going to be able to basically do AI from a technical standpoint is expanding very fast. So that's, I think, the reason for optimism that a lot of companies are going to be able to adapt. The scary thing or difficult thing is, this really shines a spotlight on which companies are really set up to run top-flight software engineering efforts, right? And which companies are going to have top-flight software engineering cultures. And say what you will about the issue with Silicon Valley companies. Like Silicon Valley companies we know that we live or die like on the basis of our technical cultures and our ability to attract and retain top-end software engineers. There's a lot of companies out in the rest of the world that it's like, well, the important people are, the business people or the marketing people or whatever, and then we have this IT department, and the IT department's kind of kept at the back, and they're not really invited out of the back. They kind of stay back there. They dress different, like they have funny habits, and we don't really want to spend that much time with them. And they're not top flight members. They're not important and influential members of the organization in the way that you would need if technology all of a sudden has become the most important thing. And I think there's a lot of companies. The car companies are a great example of this. A lot of the incumbent car companies have an opportunity and a challenge to figure out, can they basically make software engineering as important, right, in their company as hardware engineering has been historically. And I think, honestly, it's an open question.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Tesla hires way more engineers than the other ones. So, yeah, makes sense. This is a cultural change and a process change that needs to happen. I want to just switch gears a little bit. I know we're almost out of time, but, you started Netscape. You've been a big proponent of open source, behind a lot of these things in the past. How do you think open source business models around that will evolve, especially now that we have cloud and cloud vendors and it's being hosted in the cloud? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. So open source, this has been a big week for open source for those of you who follow these things. Microsoft, buying GitHub is one of those amazing events that, 10 years ago, it would have been like saying Donald Trump will be president.
Congrats, by the way.
Just like, thank you, just like flat out implausible, and yet here we are. And so, it's just, and I mean that in the sense of like, it's just amazing how far Microsoft has come as a company, right? Microsoft 10 years ago viewed open source, literally, like the two words that they kept using were cancer and communism, which is kind of amazing if you think about it, because it's like, isn't cancer bad enough without also being communist? Like, of all the forms of cancer to get, communist cancer is the worst. So to go, and obviously Satya and the team at Microsoft deserve, gigantic credit for having navigated that company to a point where they've not only fully embraced open source, like they're doing these amazing things on development of open source. They built some of the best development tools. With GitHub, they now have the best code environment. And so, that's just like a great example of a company that's evolved, from basically, flat hate all the way through to love and embrace and like really doing amazing things in the field. And so I think that's a great specific instance. And then just more generally, I mean, the scope, put it this way, open source. I've been involved in open source so long at this point. I started working on open source when literally you could work on open source. Richard Stallman, this is actually true, Richard Stallman, who is kind of the godfather of he calls it free software, but the origin of a lot of this. He believed in open source so thoroughly that in the early 90s, you could actually remote log into his Unix account at MIT. Anybody could. Username RMS, password RMS, and you could be Richard Stallman. And it was because egalitarianism, right? His sense was basically people are good, people want to contribute, people want to build things, and if somebody wants to log in as Richard Stallman and work on his code while he's asleep, fair enough, go for it. And I used to, middle of the night, there I am. And so that went from kind of that extreme an idea at that point to something that's now this mainstream, right? The world we live in today, all of our smartphones, like every smartphone of everybody here in this audience is running fundamentally on open source, right? Some derivative of Unix. And so the open source snowball, I think, is now rolling down the hill in a really amazing way. And as I said, I think it's become absolutely central to AI. Like, it's amazing how AI went from being a black box technology to something that's now usable in open source. And then I also think like open source and cloud are like a fantastic fit because, right, open source makes technologies very widely available. And then cloud makes open source and open source derived technologies much easier to deploy at scale. Right, and so to be able to have kind of the continuous kind of thread where you can learn about these things and program these things, but then also deploy them at kind of supercomputer level scale in a practical way is a really big deal. And so I think it's there's never been a more exciting time for software, and I think that's a big reason why. Awesome,
well, that's great to hear. I mean, especially for Databricks, we bet on open source, we bet on the cloud, on AI. So I have a personal question towards the end. So I want to close with this. when Ben Horowitz came to you and he said, I have these are some crazy guys out of Berkeley. They have they have this thing called Spark. I want to invest in them. What questions did you ask, and what did you think? Were there anything you did to pressure test or stress test?
Well, the problem is we'd heard some really sketchy things about the CEO.
Okay.
So
what happened?
Normally we do a full battery of background checks, but Ben said in this case we should probably just not even run those.
Okay.
But no, in all seriousness, no. You talk about 10x advance, like the nature of the 10x advance that these guys had done, and that this whole community had done was we thought just obvious and underrated by the rest of the ecosystem at the time, and so that's the best kind of investment.
I see. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you didn't do those background checks. Thanks so much.
Good. Okay, great. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.